Hello dear students, good evening, welcome to BAJIRAO IAS Academy. So today we will discuss important news articles that are covered in the Hindu newspaper. So before discussing all those news articles, so please try to subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit the like button so that we can come up with better content in the future. Okay, so yesterday I have given you one important practice question. So the question was that is with respect to Janskar Valley. The question was, Janskar Valley, which was recently seen in news, is located in which of the following states or union territories? The options are Himachal Pradesh, Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh and Sikkim. So the correct answer for this question is Ladakh. Now, while Janskar Valley is in news in recent times, that is what we will understand. So on the map, you can see where this Janskar Valley is actually located. The Janskar Valley is located in Ladakh, and now Ladakh is a union territory. We all know about that. So this is the exact location where the Janskar Valley is actually located. Now we will understand why Janskar Valley is in news. Recently, the Border Roads Organization, so this is the organization which deals with the infrastructure development across the international borders in India. So the Border Roads Organization has recently completed one strategic road project in Ladakh. The road was Nimmu, Padam and Darcha Road. So the Border Roads Organization recently completed the construction of a strategic road called Nimmu, Padam and Darcha Road. Okay, so Janskar Valley, it is locally also known as Jahar Valley or Janskar Valley. So it is actually a tehsil of Kargil district of Indian Union Territory of Ladakh. Now Janskar Valley is in news because the Border Roads Organization has recently completed the construction of one of the strategic roads called Nimmu Padam and Darcha Strategic Road, and because of that reason Janskar Valley is in news, and this is the location of Janskar Valley. Now if you look at today's practice question, so the question was in relation to a report named India Employment Report 2024, which of the following organizations are involved in this publication of this particular report? 2 days back we have discussed about this. India Employment Report is published, so that has pointed out towards the higher levels of unemployment, especially among youth. So the options are International Labour Organization, International Trade Union Confederation, Institute of Human Development, both A and C. So please try to answer this question in the comment section, and the correct answer for this question I will give in tomorrow's lecture. Now let's proceed to discuss some important news articles that are given in the Hindu newspaper, and firstly we will look at an important editorial. So that is with respect to a pandemic treaty. So we all knew that COVID-19 pandemic has created a havoc across the world, right? So it spread rampantly across the world. However, the world is also not able to cope up with a mass disease like COVID-19 pandemic. And also understand, for such pandemics we do not have any overarching framework at the global level which can deal with those diseases in a more effective manner. So therefore different countries have been thinking over an idea of establishing a pandemic treaty, establishing a permanent pandemic treaty, and that could address the future pandemics. Please understand, it is expected that in future we could face more pandemics like COVID-19 because of ongoing climate change, ongoing spread of the zoonotic diseases because of environmental degradation. So all these factors, it is expected that in future we are going to face a lot number of diseases such as COVID-19 pandemic, and in this context we need to have a pandemic treaty, a global level pandemic treaty, so that could address the pandemics that the world will face in the coming years. So it is actually a global institution. Pandemic treaty is a global instrument to to improve prevention, preparedness and response to the future pandemics, and that is the overall objective of pandemic treaty, and that is why the governments wanted to establish a pandemic treaty. Now we will understand why pandemic treaty is in use, why it is in use, why the Hindu newspaper today they have given an editorial about this pandemic treaty. It is because of some reasons. Firstly, in March 2021 there was a call that was given for pandemic treaty. Okay, so in fact 25 heads of governments and international agencies have marked a pivotal moment. Okay, so they are actually calling for establishing a pandemic treaty, and this has actually marked a pivotal moment, particularly because of there was a global effort, and the global effort was aiming to establish a pandemic treaty at the global level, and that could be able to deal with the future pandemics. And because of that reason we can say that it is a pivotal moment, because so far we do not have any such overarching framework to deal with the pandemics. Even though we have World Health Organization, but that is not enough to deal with such pandemics. And you can imagine the role of World Health Organization is criticized across the world, how World Health Organization has actually handled the COVID-19 pandemic. So because of that reason, different countries have been thinking about establishing a pandemic treaty to deal with those diseases. So the World Health Organization Pandemic Agreement final negotiations began last week. So in fact, the World Health Organization Pandemic Agreement, so that could establish a pandemic treaty, began last week. However, the approval for this particular agreement is pending in May. So it is expected that the approval for the pandemic agreement would be given in May, and its fate remains uncertain amid the global debates with respect to the pandemic treaty. And not just debates, but also differences between the developing world and the developing countries, the developing world and the developed countries with respect to different aspects. And we will look into all those aspects. What are the major differences, how to proceed further, and what are the major challenges in establishing such a global pandemic treaty. First and foremost, the aim of the global pandemic treaty. So that is what we need to understand. So if pandemic agreement is signed, that could establish us a pandemic treaty, right? So this is primarily to address a systematic failures that we have seen during COVID-19 crisis. So we already have the experience of COVID-19 pandemic, and different countries have handled the COVID-19 pandemic in different ways. And in this, so loopholes in the way we are handling COVID-19 pandemic are also emerged during that particular time. So therefore, the systematic failures revealed by the COVID-19 crisis would be addressed by this particular pandemic treaty or pandemic agreement. And at the same time, it enhances the global defense against such pandemics, and it will also prevent the future pandemics from escalating into a catastrophe to the human crisis. So how COVID-19 pandemic has emerged as a simple disease from a catastrophic disease. So this is what we need to prevent in this context. And apart from that, this particular global treaty or pandemic treaty would focus on prevention of the disease, preparedness would be further strengthened, and adequate response with equity as a goal. Right? So when I say equity, the medication should be available for all the sections of the globe, all the corners of the globe, whether rich, poor, whether accessible or unaccessible. So all those things comes into it. And after that, the coverage issues. When I say coverage issues, that particularly includes the pathogen surveillance. Now, pathogen surveillance is very important, because when we are able to undertake the surveillance of the pathogen, we will be able to know how it has been spreading from one person to the other person. And at the same time, the healthcare workforce capacity can be understood, and supply chain, logistics, technology transfer of vaccine production, and waivers of intellectual property rights. So all those issues need to be looked into by this particular pandemic agreement. For example, during COVID-19 pandemic, India and South Africa have together proposed to waive the TRIPS protection that is being extended to the manufacturing of vaccines, so that it ensures vaccine equity. It ensures vaccine equity for all people, because poor people cannot afford vaccines, and countries like India and South Africa have proposed to waive off the TRIPS protection for these vaccines and vaccine manufacturing technologies or patents, so that it could ensure the vaccine equity. And apart from that, we should look into the supply chain and logistics issues and technology transfer from one country which has already developed technologies to other countries, so that they can also manufacture the vaccines and provide vaccines for the people. And at the same time, the existing healthcare workforce capacity also. For example, if you look at India, so India's healthcare professionals in comparison to total population is very less. So therefore, this particular gap was also exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we should also look into it. We should further increase the presence of healthcare professionals in our healthcare sector. And apart from that, the pathogen surveillance is also very important, because when we undertake the surveillance, we will be able to predict and we will also be able to take the early interventions with respect to the particular pathogen, right? So thereby containing the spread of disease. And apart from that, it also aims to strengthen the surveillance of pathogens with pandemic potential. For example, there are certain pathogens which can turn into pandemics, and they can create a large scale catastrophe. So therefore, surveillance would be emphasized, and apart from that, they will also manage the antimicrobial resistance as part of this particular treaty. Okay, the pandemic treaty. Now, antimicrobial resistance is a major challenge now, right? So because of overdose of drugs or medicines, wrong prescriptions, and apart from that, wrong prescriptions and contamination and pollution of our water resources and soil. So all those factors have been leading to the antimicrobial resistance among the existing pathogens, and the pandemic treaty and pandemic agreement would also deal with this pandemic resistance. So because that is also very important to deal with any kind of a disease. And next, we need to look at the equitable access as a major aspect. Now, emphasis on equitable access to medical products. So when I say emphasis on equitable access to medical products, that essentially means that there will be no distinction between rich and poor. There will be no distinction between two different genders, and there will be no discrimination among the different sections of the society. So in order to ensure vaccine equity, there are certain things which are necessary. Firstly, the technology transfer from the developed countries to the developing countries, so that the developing countries can also strengthen their capacities. So they can strengthen their capacities. So apart from strengthening their capacities, they will be able to provide vaccines and medicines to their population, and thereby protecting the health care of the people who are in the vulnerable category. So apart from that, it will also talks about the access and benefit sharing and supply and procurement of these medicines or vaccines. So this is actually the essence of equitable access. However, during COVID-19 pandemic, it is believed that vaccine equity was not that much effective that the global leaders have actually been talking about. So in fact, there are instances where countries like US have started to hoard vaccines for their own population. But on the other hand, what about the people who do not have even the basic amenities? So therefore, we need to talk about the equitable access of vaccine and medications to all people. And apart from that, it also envisioned setting up of a conference of parties. setting up of conference of parties, and that is very important because if you look at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so that also has conference of parties. So this conference of parties, they will meet once in 2 years or once in 1 year, and they will take major decisions with respect to the action plan in the future. So this particular pandemic agreement or pandemic treaty also emphasizes on establishment of a comprehensive conference of parties, and it will oversee the implementation of overall pandemic agreement, right? So apart from that, there are certain disagreements between developing and developed countries with respect to the establishment of the pandemic agreement and pandemic treaty. So firstly, we will see the a conflict between developing and developed countries. So each of these countries or each of these blocks have the different opinions with respect to the pandemic treaty. So each of these countries have different opinions. So firstly, if you look at the developing countries, so developing countries are largely emphasizing on vaccine equity. Now, why they are emphasizing on vaccine equity? Because those countries lack resources, and those countries also lack the financial resources, and they also lack the technology also to manufacture vaccines and medicines. And most of the poor people live in these developing countries and underdeveloped countries. So therefore, they are emphasizing on vaccine equity and at the same time the clarity on obligations versus responsibilities. So they are demanding that all the developed countries should have the greater obligations and they should have a greater responsibilities compared to the developing countries, because the developing countries are starved of resources. They have the higher levels of population, lower levels of technology. So therefore, the developed countries are actually responsible for the climate change. So therefore, they need to have a greater responsibility towards this when it comes to the financing the pandemic treaty. So after that, the developed countries have been criticizing this particular text of the pandemic treaty. So they are criticizing it regarding financing and intellectual property issues, considering them as red lines, because the major burden of financing will be on the developed countries, and at the same time these developed countries very often come up with sound technologies to manufacture medicines and vaccines. So when the IPR, the intellectual property rights, would be wiped off under this agreement or under this treaty, then of course the developed countries would suffer. So because of that reason, the developed countries have also been expressing certain reservations on this text. And after that, there are disagreements between both developed and developing countries, and developing countries, which are being represented by India among others, they have been stressing on importance of the clarity on obligations and responsibilities. So what are the obligations? What should be the responsibilities? So there should be clarity on this. This is what the developing countries have been demanding. And apart from that, they are also demanding the equity within the agreement, operationalization of equity within the agreement, so that equity will benefit all the countries in the future in case of any pandemic. However, there are certain concerns related to the pandemic agreement. So what are those concerns? First concern is equity concern. I've already told you what does equity actually means. So equity means equitable access of medicine and vaccines to all people irrespective of any discrimination or distinctions. So there are there's dissatisfaction among the developed countries and the pharmaceutical industry, because pharmaceutical industry very often comes up with the new technologies and new medicine. So of course there is a dissatisfaction from the developed and pharmaceutical industry regarding the equity, vaccine equity, and at the same time the benefit sharing provisions. So that could not benefit these pharmaceutical industry and developed countries, and because of that reason they have been expressing certain reservations. And after that, we should also look at the global enforcement and global governance mechanisms, because you have a treaty or you have an agreement, and in case any pandemic in future, there will be no enforcement mechanism of this particular agreement or treaty. So that will make it ineffective. That will make the pandemic treaty, that will make the pandemic treaty ineffective in the future. So therefore there is a lack of adequate enforcement mechanisms, and when there's a lack of adequate enforcement mechanisms, so those mechanisms pose a significant challenge. Without robust investment, the agreement risks being symbolic. So this is just a symbolic and this is not effective. So therefore the author has been demanding that there should be a proper enforcement mechanism that should be set up in place. After that, there are certain issues which are being related to the technology transfer also, because technology transfer is important. So technology transfer ensures vaccine equity, right? So technology transfer ensures vaccine equity among the people. And even with the consensus on key issues like technology transfer and intellectual property waivers, the agreement may be ineffective if it does not have the robust enforcement mechanisms. For example, imagine pandemic treaty came into force, and in this particular pandemic treaty we have talked about the technology transfer from developed countries to developing countries, and also a waiver for the intellectual property is also provided under this particular pandemic treaty. So even though providing all those things, if there is no enforcement mechanism, this will not be effective enough to deal with the future pandemics, and that is what the author has been emphasizing on. So therefore there is a need for global governance and enforcement mechanisms that should set up in place, that should be set up to deal with the global pandemics. And what should be the way forward in this context? So the way forward would be a collective effort, because in future if any pandemic has emerged, since we are living in a globalized world, and the spread of these pandemic or spread of these pathogens is so quick that most of the countries are getting infected within days. Okay, so therefore the agreement has acknowledged that no single government or no single country can tackle the threat in the future of pandemic. So suppose in case of any pandemic in the future, one single country cannot be able to tackle the pandemic, and one single institution also cannot be able to tackle the pandemic. So that is where we require a collaborative and collective effort. And that particular collaborative and collective effort can be achieved through a comprehensive pandemic treaty at the global level. This comprehensive pandemic treaty at the global level would ensure the collective effort to deal with any future pandemic, and this is what the author has been emphasizing. However, along with the vaccine equity provisions in this pandemic treaty, the author has also been emphasizing on global enforcement mechanisms to enforce the provisions in the pandemic treaty in order to deal with those future pandemics in a more effective manner. However, finally, the pandemic agreement aims to address the COVID-19 failures. There are certain failures and there are certain issues when we dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. And this particular pandemic agreement is aiming to address those failures. And it has also been emphasizing on equity, and at the same time future preparedness for any such diseases. So however, disagreements between developed and developing countries persist, especially with respect to access, technology transfer, waiver of intellectual property rights, and enforcement mechanisms. However, overall, the negotiations between different parties aiming for consensus. Okay, so when any particular agreement has been aiming for the consensus, so there is a chance of dilution, and at the same time, because different countries have been pressurizing to fix this agreement. So dilution on vaccine equity, dilution on lack of enforcement mechanisms or technology transfer would certainly impact the developing countries. and it will also impact the vaccine equity, thereby making the existing global pandemic agreement ineffective in future to deal with any such diseases. So therefore global collective effort is necessary, and we should also understand each other's concern and build consensus that is acceptable for all parties to deal with any future pandemic as effectively as possible. Okay, so that is it in this article. And next we will understand India's coal imports. India's coal imports. So this is another editorial that is being given in the Hindu newspaper. Now please understand, in India around 55% of electricity, total electricity, is produced from the thermal power plants. Okay, thermal power plants, and we also know that the thermal power plants use coal as a feedstock to produce electricity. However, since majority of our electricity production is from thermal power plants, the domestic production of coal is not sufficient to meet the excess demand of electricity and thermal power plants. So because of that reason, the thermal power plants have been started importing coal from other countries. Okay, so the countries like Russia, Australia, Indonesia, South Africa, US, so these are the major countries from which we import coal to meet our increasing demand, to ensure energy security for our populations, right? Energy security for our populations. However, the increasing import of coal would have impact on the consumers by increasing the electricity cost. So therefore, in this context, the author has been looking at India's coal imports in a multi-dimensional manner, and we will also understand what the author has been trying to convey. So what is the context? The context is, with the onset of hot weather, there's a concern about electricity shortages, and that has resurfaced in India recently. Now in summers, during hot weather conditions, what happens? The energy demand significantly increases. So why? Because people use these electrical appliances to escape from the heat, and because of that reason, the energy demand during summers exceptionally increases. So however, in order to meet the increased energy demand, what thermal power plants do? Thermal power plants use domestic coal, and at the same time they have started importing coal from different other countries to produce higher amounts of electricity, thereby meeting the increased consumer demand. Okay, so since summer is starting and increased energy demand has led to the domestic coal shortages. So if we are not able to supply adequate amount of domestic coal during summer seasons, we will have to depend on imported coal. Okay, so imported coal certainly comes with certain negative things. Now in this context, the discussion primarily revolves around the shortage of domestic thermal coal, and at the same time the challenges in its logistics leading to the potential disruptions in electricity supply. For example, one logistical issue with respect to coal is lack of railway rakes availability to transport the coal to the thermal power plants. So if railways are not able to supply adequate coal to the thermal power plants, then they would reduce their operational capacities, and of course that will also reduces the available energy in the market or available energy in the economy, and thereby further increasing the existing energy demand. So when we talk about the coal has been facing certain logistical issues, okay, particularly with respect to transporting coal from the coal fields to the thermal power plants. Now when we talk about these logistic issues, first and foremost thing that we need to understand is that thermal power plants have been producing the electricity, okay, using coal as a feedstock. Now if you look at the electricity shortage that took place in August 2023, in August 2023 we have faced a massive electricity shortage, and that massive electricity shortage is attributed to poor monsoon, and that has underscored the challenges in meeting the increased demand amid reduced supply. Now on the one hand, coal supply is reduced, okay, supply of coal is reduced or declined, but on the other hand, due to poor monsoon, the summer heat, the existing temperatures have further increased, and increasing temperatures means that also increases the energy demand in the market from the consumers. However, when there is a poor supply, the thermal power plants will not be able to meet the increasing demand from the consumers. And second thing is that we need to talk about the inadequate availability of logistic facilities to transport the coal from coal fields to the thermal power plants. So despite having the ample amount of coal reserves in mines in India, the logistic issues that we have been facing with respect to transportation of coal has been hampering the transportation of coal to these power plants. So that is the second major logistical issue that we have been facing, and there are also certain transportation bottlenecks across India with respect to the transportation of coal. So in fact, the Ministry of Power has provided a advisory. So the Ministry of Power advisory has been emphasizing on certain logistical constraints which are being associated with the railway network, and that has emphasized the need to address transportation bottlenecks. Okay, so it is true that the railway rakes are not available to transport the coal from coal mines to the thermal power plants, and thermal power plants require a lot of coal to produce electricity, and therefore in this context we should also look into the supply side bottlenecks, particularly the transportation bottlenecks. So that is how we can supply adequate coal to these thermal power plants, and that will help to meet the increased energy demand. And after that, we should also understand the issue of import of coal. Okay, so we should be able to explore the alternatives sources of coal rather than depending on import of coal. Okay, so because coal being India's primary energy source, because most of the electricity is being produced from the coal itself, and we have not yet diversified our energy basket. Okay, we have not fully diversified our energy market, and renewables are still in the phase of transition or developing phase. So therefore, in this context, it is suggested that exploring alternatives to coal sources becomes crucial to mitigate the shortages. For example, the Ministry of Power has mandated the biomass co-firing in power plants. Biomass co-firing in thermal power plants. So biomass co-firing actually mandates that use of biomass pellets in place of coal, so that could reduce excess demand of coal in these thermal power plants. So therefore we need to explore other alternatives to coal. Thereby we will be able to meet increased coal demand and reduce our import dependency on coal. And secondly, recently Ministry of Power has issued an advisory regarding the coal imports. Okay, so this particular advisory from the Ministry of Power, it is said that the author has been emphasizing that it is very often misinterpreted as a mandate that recommends monitoring coal stocks and importing up to 6% by weight as needed. So actually the author has been emphasizing that this is not a mandate, and in case the thermal power plants are not able to meet the required amount of coal, they can import a certain amount of coal from other countries. So this is what the ministry has said, and it is very often misinterpreted by the various thermal power plants. And after that, we should also talk about the cost implications. Now when we are importing coal from other countries, so that is a costly affair. So importing coal from other countries is a costly affair. So the misinterpretation of this particular advisory as a mandate of 6% coal imports could significantly impact the electricity costs and affecting the consumers also. And at the same time, the increased coal imports elevate the variable costs of electricity. Okay, so therefore this could further increase the burden, the cost burden on the consumers, and that should be avoided. Okay, so increased cost burden on the consumers would not be welcomed, right? It should not be appreciated. So therefore these factors have to be kept in mind, and we should look into the alternatives that are being available as of now. And after that, diverse power plant characteristics is also a factor. So power plants vary in generation capacity and proximity to coal mines and susceptibility to shortages. For example, there are certain power plants which are highly susceptible to these shortages. They completely stop the producing electricity. And at the same time, there are certain certain thermal power plants which are located very close to these coal mines, so they will have adequate amount of coal. Okay, so and there are certain thermal power plants that varies, those are having a varying degrees of energy generation capacities. So if you look at the pit head plants, thermal power plants, they are situated very close to mines, and they less likely to face shortages compared to the plants which are located farther away. For example, imagine this is a coal field. Okay, so very simple, that is, this is a coal field, and very near to the coal field there is a thermal power plant, and this thermal power plant would be able to receive the adequate amount of coal for producing electricity. On the other hand, if another power plant B, which is located far away from the thermal power plant, it would be difficult to receive the coal. It would be difficult to meet the shortages of coal. So thereby it is emphasized that the logistics have to be improved to ensure adequate supply of coal to all these factories. And after that, the cost effective solutions have to be proposed. So regulatory commissions and utilities, they should focus on identifying the most cost effective solutions to address the shortages, considering the factors defaulting the coal imports. The factors which are other than the coal imports have to be explored to reduce or to address the existing shortages. Okay, so that's all in this coal imports, and let's try to discuss the next important news article. So this news article is with respect to Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Armed Forces Special Powers Act, right? So recently Union Home Ministry has decided to include few districts of Arunachal Pradesh and Nagaland as part of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So we will understand what exactly is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, but first we will try to understand what is the news says. Now on this image you can clearly see that there are different districts in northeast, such as Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and even Manipur, Nagaland. So all those different states where Armed Forces Special Powers Act is being imposed. For example, in Nagaland, Armed Forces Special Powers Act was first introduced in 1958, and Mizoram 1967 and removed in 1986. Tripura, it was introduced in 1970, removed in 2015. Manipur, it was introduced in 1980. Arunachal Pradesh, it was introduced in 1987. Assam, it was introduced in 1990, and Meghalaya, it was introduced in 1990 and removed in 2018. So when we talk about Northeast, insurgency in Northeast is a most common phenomenon, right? So this is very often violent in nature. So that has been threatening peace and security. Okay, so that has been threatening peace plus security in the Northeast. So therefore, in order to deal with the violent insurgency, the central government would identify certain red corridors, okay, certain districts or certain regions in Northeast, and implement the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So in order to prevent or curb violent insurgency in those regions. Okay, for that particular purpose, the central government has brought the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Now you can clearly see that there are different states in which the Armed Forces Special Powers Act was introduced and then removed. So recently, the government has extended Armed Forces Special Powers Act in few districts of Arunachal Pradesh and few districts of Nagaland. So that is particularly to protect the law and order situation and at the same time maintain peace and stability, security in the districts. Now first understand why exactly is in news. It is in news because the Armed Forces Special Powers Act extension in parts of Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh for the period of 6 months, and that is mainly aiming to maintain security and combat the existing violent insurgency. So for that particular purpose, the central government, particularly the Union Home Ministry, has decided to extend the Armed Forces Special Powers Act for 6 months to these two states. So if you look at the extension details of this order from the Union Home Ministry, the Union Home Ministry prolonged the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in parts of Nagaland and Arunachal Pradesh for a period of 6 months. So we also know that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act was imposed or introduced again in Arunachal Pradesh and Nagaland to deal with insurgency and at the same time maintain peace in those districts. In Nagaland, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is extended across 8 districts and 21 police stations effective from April 1st, unless it was withdrawn earlier by the Union government. Secondly, in Arunachal Pradesh, Armed Forces Special Powers Act continues in 3 districts and areas under the 3 police stations in Namsai district of Arunachal Pradesh. So this is briefly about the introduction of Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Now if you look at what exactly is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, so the Armed Forces Special Powers Act was originated from the Armed Forces Special Powers Bill passed in 1958. So this particular bill was passed in 1958, and apart from that, it was enacted due to the escalation of violence in several northeastern states. I've already told you that in Northeast, insurgency was the main challenge. In order to deal with the insurgency in Northeast, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act was introduced in different states in Northeastern region. So it empowers armed forces to maintain the public order and disturbed areas. And at the same time, it also grants the authority to disperse gatherings, use force and make arrests without actually warrants. So because of this particular reason, it is often dubbed that the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is very often draconian in nature, and at the same time it has been violating the human rights as well as the fundamental rights of the people who are living in the areas where Armed Forces Special Powers Act has been imposed. So because of that reason, ARMSFA is very often criticized by different groups, and it also allows for entry, search, seizure without warrants and bans on possession of firearms. So all these reasons, it is said that Armed Forces Special Powers Act is very often equipped or empowered with highly exceptional powers, and that has been impacting the rights of the people who are living in those regions. Okay, so this is all about the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and that was introduced in the Arunachal Pradesh. So next, a very important news article is with respect to India's private space firm called Skyroot. Okay, so this is India's first major private space firm. So Skyroot Aerospace of Vikram 1 launched successfully test fires stage 2 vehicle in Andhra Pradesh, Sriharikota. Okay, so this essentially means that Skyroot Aerospace, that is a private space firm, successfully test fires stage 2 of the Vikram 1 launch vehicle in Andhra Pradesh, Sriharikota. Right? So in this context, we will understand briefly what exactly is the Skyroot, and then we'll proceed on to discuss the recent developments with respect to the Skyroot. So what makes India's first privately built rocket special? That is Skyroot's Vikram. Yes, So Vikram yes is actually India's first privately built rocket. Okay, so first this is recently Vikram 1 in news, not Vikram yes. Vikram yes is in fact Skyroute's first rocket. India's first privately built rocket is Vikram yes. So after Vikram yes, they have tested Vikram 1. Okay, first Vikram yes, and then they have tested Vikram 1. Right. So in this context, we will understand first about Vikram yes. The Vikram yes was first tested in the year 2022 by the Skyroot Aerospace. Followed by that, they have tested Vikram 1. Now in this context, the Vikram yes was launch vehicle or rocket that was developed by a Telangana Kondapur based space tech startup, that is Skyroot. Okay, so it is a Telangana based India's private space company, that is Skyroot. So the firm was launched by two former ISRO scientists, Pavan Kumar Chandana and Nagabharat Dakha. So they have launched this in the year 2018, and Skyroot so far has raised around 68 million funding. Okay, so far it has raised 68 million in funding. Now if you can look at the Vikram yes, some details of Vikram yes. Now please remember Vikram yes was test fired in the year 2022 from the Sriharikota. So after Vikram yes, they have recently test fired Vikram 1. Okay, so please understand the difference. Now if you look at the Vikram, so it was Vikram yes, it was made using a composite materials. Okay, so this is actually having an all carbon fiber core structure, Vikram yes, and apart from that, it is also equipped with 3D printed engines for spin stability during the flight. So this 3D printed engines would provide the spin stability to the rocket, and at the same time the company has also claimed that to be one of the cheapest rockets that are built in its category globally. Now India globally known for its cheapest space missions, and this particular private space firm also inherited the record of ISRO in making or manufacturing the cheapest rockets, and around 200 engineer team worked to build it in a record time of 2 years. Okay, so in Vikram yes, the technology demonstration was primarily to test 80% of onboard technologies for the company's future Vikram series launches. For example, Vikram yes followed by that Vikram 1. So this is Vikram series launches. So therefore they have tested 80% of companies or 80% of rockets onboard technologies for companies future Vikram series launches, and at the same time the effectiveness of in-flight avionics in Vikram yes, and at the same time telemetry, tracking, inertial measurement, GPS camera, data acquisition and power systems, all those things were tested initially during the Vikram yes satellite launch. So some technical details with respect to Vikram yes: its total mass 546 kilograms, length 8 meters, diameter 0.376 meters, and its peak vacuum thrust, peak composition pressure. So all those things are mentioned here, so that is not much significant. So Skyroot Aerospace test fires stage 2. Okay, so the first stage was Vikram yes, so that was launched in the year 2022, and stage 2 was Vikram 1. So they have tested stage 2 of Vikram 1 launch vehicle, and it is actually considered as milestone towards India's first private orbital rocket launch. Right, next if you look at the some details of Skyroot Aerospace test, it fires stage 2 of Vikram 1 launch vehicle. Okay, so this is considered as stage 2, and stage 1 was Vikram yes. Okay, stage 1 was Vikram yes, and that was launched earlier, and this is stage 2 of Vikram series of satellites, and that is Vikram 1. Firstly, successful test firing. The Skyroot Aerospace conducts a successful test firing of stage 2 of Vikram series satellites. Okay, so this successfully conducting test firing of stage 2 rocket is known known as Vikram 1 launch vehicle. And apart from that, the test conducted at ISRO's Satish Dhawan Space Center in Sriharikota, Andhra Pradesh. So generally it is very well known for conducting launches from a space center in Sriharikota, Satish Dhawan Space Center. So what is the significance of stage 2, that is Vikram 1? So what is the significance of Vikram 1? So it is significant because the stage 2 is crucial for propelling the rocket through Earth's atmosphere and at the same time into the space during the launch. So because of that reason, it is very significant, and at the same time it plays a pivotal role in ascent phase of the launch vehicle, and because of these two reasons, the stage 2 of Vikram 1 is very significant. Now if you look at some details with respect to Vikram 1 rocket. So Vikram 1 rocket, named after Vikram Sarabhai, he was the pioneer of India's space program. And Vikram 1 is a multi-stage launch vehicle. So that was developed by Skyroot Aerospace. Third, so it can carry the weight up to 300 kilogram to low Earth orbit, and at the same time it uses an all carbon fiber body similar to Vikram IAS. Okay, similar to Vikram IAS, it also uses all carbon fiber body, and that will enable it to do multiple satellite launches, and at the same time it very often uses solid fuel design. So this solid fuel design allows quick assembly of these rockets within 24 hours from any site. So all these are the advantages, and these advantages have been making Vikram series of rockets much more cheaper globally. Okay, so the key achievements of Vikram 1 satellite launch was it marks India's first private orbital rocket launch, and it is also a significant milestone for country's space sector because it influences and inspires other private space industry, and it also significantly attracts a lot of private investment and foreign investment into India's space sector. And recently, remember, the government has also changed the rules with respect to the foreign direct investment in space sector, and that would give further boost to the India's space industry. So if you look at the previous suborbital launch of Vikram IAS by Skyroot Aerospace, that is Vikram IAS, so it was launched in November 2022, and that has paved way for the achievement of this Vikram 1 stage 2 rocket launch. Okay, so that's all about the Vikram 1 orbital rocket launch by a private space firm called Skyroot Aerospace. Okay, so that's all for today's lecture, and thank you so much. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel and also hit the like button. Thank you.